Venezuela was once one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. For much of the 20th century, it enjoyed high living standards, vast oil revenues, and a relatively stable political system. Yet within a few decades, the country experienced one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history. Hyperinflation, widespread shortages, mass emigration, and the breakdown of basic services became part of everyday life. How did this happen? How did a nation with the largest proven oil reserves in the world fall into such deep economic crisis? To understand Venezuela's collapse, we must examine a series of political and economic reforms implemented over time and the structural weaknesses that made those reforms so destructive. Before the crisis, Venezuela's economy was already highly dependent on oil. By the late 20th century, petroleum accounted for the overwhelming majority of export revenues and government income. This dependency created a fragile economic structure. When oil prices were high, the state could fund social programs, imports, and subsidies. When prices fell, the economy had very little else to rely on. Despite this vulnerability, successive governments failed to diversify the economy in any meaningful way.
In 1999, Hugo Chavez rose to power, promising profound change. His political project, known as the Bolivarian Revolution, aimed to reduce inequality, expand social welfare, and increase state control over key sectors of the economy. A central component of this project was a wave of economic reforms that fundamentally reshaped Venezuela's institutions. One of the first major reforms was the expansion of state ownership. Industries such as oil, electricity, telecommunications, steel, agriculture, and retail were nationalized or brought under heavy state control. At the same time, the government imposed strict price controls on basic goods, including food and medicine, in an effort to keep prices affordable for the population. Currency controls were also introduced. The government fixed the exchange rate and restricted access to foreign currency, creating multiple official exchange rates alongside a growing black market. In theory, these measures were designed to protect consumers and strengthen national sovereignty. In practice, they distorted incentives across the entire economy. Price controls made it unprofitable for producers to manufacture or import essential goods. Currency controls made it nearly impossible for businesses to access dollars needed for imports. As a result, shortages became increasingly common. The oil sector itself, the backbone of the Venezuelan economy, was not spared. The state oil company, PDVSA, was increasingly politicized. Experienced engineers and managers were replaced with political loyalists. Investment declined. Maintenance was neglected. Oil production steadily fell, even before international sanctions were imposed. As oil revenues declined, government spending continued to rise. Large social programs were funded almost entirely through oil income, without sustainable financial planning. When revenues were no longer sufficient, the government turned to monetary expansion. The central bank gradually lost its independence. What was once a technical institution became a political instrument. Instead of controlling inflation, it began financing government spending. Money was printed to cover growing fiscal deficits. At first, the effects seemed manageable, but over time, the consequences became impossible to ignore. This decision triggered one of the most severe episodes of hyperinflation in recorded history. The national currency, the bolivar, rapidly lost value. Not over years. Not even over months. Sometimes it happened within days. Sometimes within hours. Prices changed constantly. What was affordable in the morning could be unreachable by night. Savings were wiped out. Entire lifetimes of accumulated income disappeared. Wages became meaningless, unable to keep pace with rising prices. Economic survival replaced long-term planning. But Venezuela's collapse did not occur in isolation from its political institutions. Over time, checks and balances weakened. Independent oversight eroded. Economic decisions became increasingly centralized. As institutional accountability declined, corruption expanded. Public trust in economic management collapsed alongside the currency itself. External shocks further intensified the crisis. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed. For a country almost entirely dependent on petroleum exports, the impact was devastating. Government revenue fell sharply. Foreign reserves dried up. The ability to import essential goods declined even further. Without oil income to sustain spending, monetary expansion accelerated. The inflationary spiral tightened. The collapse of Venezuela's economy was not the result of a single policy, nor was it caused by one isolated reform. It was the cumulative outcome of extreme oil dependency, of distorted economic incentives, of institutional decay, and of years of unsustainable economic planning. Taken together, these forces transformed a resource-rich nation into one of the most severe economic failures of the modern era. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed sharply. For a nation that was almost entirely dependent on petroleum exports, the impact was immediate and devastating. Oil revenues, which had sustained public spending for decades, fell in a matter of months. Government income declined faster than the state's capacity to adapt. Foreign reserves were rapidly depleted, limiting Venezuela's ability to import food, medicine, and industrial inputs. The economic model that had relied on sustained oil income revealed its structural fragility. Despite sporadic attempts at limited reform, the Venezuelan economy entered a prolonged period of stagnation. Inflation accelerated. Public services deteriorated. Electricity outages, water shortages, and failing infrastructure became increasingly common. Shortages of basic goods persisted, reshaping daily life for millions of citizens. Political tensions intensified alongside economic decline. Beginning in the mid-2010s, waves of protests spread across major urban centers. Demonstrators cited rising living costs, food shortages, and declining institutional legitimacy. Security forces responded with increasing force, deepening polarization and eroding trust between the state and civil society. Throughout this period, Nicolas Maduro remained in power. He had assumed the presidency in 2013 following the death of Hugo Chavez, inheriting an economy already weakened by years of structural imbalance. Maduro's administration sought to preserve the core elements of the Bolivarian economic framework. Social programs continued to rely heavily on public spending, even as revenue sources diminished. Political control became more centralized as opposition movements gained momentum. Elections were held regularly, but their credibility was increasingly questioned. International observers, foreign governments, and domestic opposition groups raised concerns about transparency, institutional independence, and electoral fairness. As political legitimacy weakened, economic management became more reactive than strategic.
Currency controls remained in place, distorting exchange rates and incentivizing black market activity. Price controls continued to discourage domestic production and imports. Monetary expansion persisted as the government sought to finance deficits in the absence of sufficient revenue. By the early 2020s, Venezuela's crisis had evolved beyond economics alone. It had become a multi-dimensional emergency, political, humanitarian, and institutional. Millions of Venezuelans left the country in search of stability and opportunity. This mass migration represented one of the largest population displacements in modern Latin American history. International responses diverged. Some governments emphasized humanitarian assistance and diplomatic engagement. Others imposed sanctions, asset freezes, and travel restrictions targeting members of the Venezuelan leadership. In the United States, legal scrutiny intensified. Federal prosecutors announced indictments against high-ranking Venezuelan officials, including Nicolás Maduro. The charges alleged involvement in transnational criminal networks, narco-trafficking operations, and corruption schemes.
While the Venezuelan government rejected these accusations as politically motivated, the legal actions signaled a significant escalation in international pressure. As economic collapse, political isolation, and legal challenges converged, Venezuela's leadership faced increasing constraints, both domestically and abroad. In early 2026, the crisis entered an unprecedented phase. According to official statements and international reporting, United States military and law enforcement agencies carried out a coordinated operation in Caracas. The operation was presented as an effort to enforce existing indictments and arrest warrants issued by U.S. judicial authorities. During the operation, Nicolás Maduro, who continued to exercise executive authority, was detained. If confirmed, this event would represent a rare moment in modern international history, the apprehension of a sitting head of state through direct foreign intervention justified on legal grounds. Following his detention, Maduro was transported to the United States and later appeared before a federal court in Manhattan, New York. Global reactions were deeply divided. Some framed the event as accountability. Others warned of dangerous precedents for international sovereignty. The events of 2026 marked a defining moment in Venezuela's long crisis. They illustrated how years of economic mismanagement, institutional erosion, and political confrontation can culminate in consequences that extend far beyond national borders.